Hello, I'm Esther Githu-Ewart. Welcome to Africa 54. Here's what's coming up. Over 150 people are dead in southern Ethiopia from two massive landslides. Search and rescue efforts are ongoing. What's next after U.S. President Joe Biden steps out of the presidential race? We'll have a report and reaction. And in our health report, more than 10,000 participants attend the 25th International AIDS Conference in Munich, Germany. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. Two landslides in southern Ethiopia have killed at least 157 people, and the death toll could rise further. VOA's Philip Alexiou has the details.
The death toll from two landslides in southern Ethiopia has risen sharply to over 150. That's according to the head of the National Disaster Response Agency in Gofa Zone, who said on Tuesday the number could increase further. Marcos Melise said the search is ongoing and that there were bodies yet to be recovered. Officials had reported on Monday that 50 people had died. That's after heavy rain overnight caused a first landslide and then a second buried people who had gathered to help. Women, children, and local police were reported to be among the dead. Philip Alexiou, VOA News, Washington.
This just into VOA. U.S. Secret Service Director Kimberly Chito has resigned after coming under fire for the agency's failure to stop an assassination attempt of former President Donald Trump during a campaign rally. The Secret Service, which is responsible for the protection of current and former U.S. presidents, is facing a crisis after a gunman was able to fire on Trump, hitting him in the ear from a roof overlooking the outdoor rally in Butler, Pennsylvania on July 13th. U.S. President Joe Biden's decision to depart the presidential race was shocking. VOA White House correspondent Anita Powell has more.
What happens now in American politics after President Joe Biden's stunning Sunday withdrawal from the presidential race? By Monday morning, it seemed everyone had a theory. But first, some reflections on the past from the person now taking center stage. On Monday, Biden's presidential pick, Vice President Kamala Harris, made her first post-announcement appearance, hosting college athletes at a White House event. She said Biden, who is recovering from COVID-19 at his Delaware home and has not been seen publicly since last week, is recovering fast.
Joe Biden's legacy of accomplishment over the past 3 years is unmatched in modern history. In one term, he has already, yes, you may clap. In one term, he has already surpassed the legacy of most presidents who have served 2 terms in office.
But Biden's Republican critics question whether he should remain president.
If everyone acknowledges it, running a campaign, it's really
Supporters are more upbeat, with top Democrats lining up behind Harris.
I have every confidence that she could beat Donald Trump, and I'm very excited about how quickly people are coming together to support her candidacy.
So what happens now? First, a disclaimer.
Research has found that political pundits are worse at predicting political outcomes than dart-throwing monkeys are. So I would take anything anybody like me says with several grains of salt.
Historians dismiss the idea that this stunning turn of events could cause instability.
I think the White House is a much larger machine than the president himself. And in effect, he is going to be a lame duck president. We've had lame duck presidents in the past, and that's not really an issue or not a terrible danger.
And some analysts say that, in a way, this makes the whole election simpler.
There'll be a division of responsibilities. He'll be the president. Kamala Harris will be the candidate. And this makes it easier for both of them in a way, because each has a distinct job.
Which brings us to the biggest question of all, the one only American voters can answer in November. Who gets to live here for the next 4 years? Anita Powell, VOA News, the White House.
U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris has secured enough support from Democratic delegates to become the party's nominee in the November presidential election against Republican candidate Donald Trump, according to media sources. VOA's Paul Ndiho spoke to Yetunde Odubesan-Omede, a professor of global affairs and politics, who noted that Harris has already broken barriers and could shatter more.
There have been also questions within the party of what are some of the strategic moves that needs to be made to ensure that they have the right candidate to beat Trump in the upcoming election. And we now know that this is a decision that they have made. And in less than 24 hours after that announcement of President Biden not seeking re-election and fully endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris for presidency for the Democrat Party, she has received really a ton of support, which is unprecedented. So, we're yet to see whom she may pick, for her running mate. But I mean, a lot of the new developments that are coming about, people are just grappling with the new news and just trying to make sure things are in order when it comes to each of their respective parties.
A lot of Democrats are excited about Harris's endorsement. There are a lot of people who think that, yes, she could take on Trump, given her expertise as a former prosecutor, a senator. But on the Republican side, they're saying, wait a minute, Trump has run against a woman who was very, very popular, Hillary Clinton, and he beat Hillary Clinton. What can Kamala Harris expect from Donald Trump?
It's going to be a tough fight. We know that anyone entering in the ring with former President Trump, they need to prepare themselves. This is not going to be what we call a collegial, conversation or dialogue. We know that it probably will get dirty, and I'm sure she's well aware of that, has been on the campaign trail. I don't question her ability to go against Donald Trump or to stand against Donald Trump. I think she is prepared to do so. And I'm not expecting them to have anything rosy to say, about Vice President Harris's politics. But at the same time, I think the American people have seen President Trump over the years and have been able to make their own assessments of him. Prior to that, the public knew of Donald Trump and knew who he was outside of politics. They knew who he was on the campaign trail. But when you have 4 years of a presidency, people are able to now decide and do a comparative analysis of whether is this someone who I want to see back in the Oval Office? Is this someone who I can support to lead this country?
How does the race factor play into this? For example, Kamala Harris is a woman of color. She's running against a white man, a white male, dominant male. And there are a lot of people who think that perhaps Donald Trump could take advantage of this scenario.
Her diversity is something that is a benefit to the country and something that many people can relate to. And I think that is something that is her strength. And that will be something that we will see she probably will utilize, right, during the campaign trail. And if that is the strategy that former President Trump chooses to attack or chooses to use as a form of a disadvantage to during his campaign tactics, that may backfire on him. We live in a world that is increasingly more diverse. We live in a world that is globalized in nature. And anything where we're trying to repeal or attack or undermine the power of diversity and diversity of thought, diversity of skin color, diversity of age, I think, it's not beneficial in the long run.
That was Yetunde Odubesan-Omede, professor of global affairs and politics at the State University of New York, Farmingdale State College. According to the Washington Post newspaper, Vice President Kamala Harris will not preside over the Senate chamber when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addresses a joint meeting of the U.S. Congress on Wednesday. In talks with top U.S. officials, including President Biden, Netanyahu is looking for progress in U.S.-led efforts to mediate an end to the 9-month Israel-Hamas war. The Prime Minister's visit comes as the number of Palestinians killed in Gaza nears 40,000, according to the Associated Press. White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara has more.
Israeli strikes in eastern Khan Yunis killed dozens of people Monday. Hundreds more fled after evacuation orders. This is the scene that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu left to travel to another battlefield, this one political, as the U.S. presidential campaign is upended following President Joe Biden's decision not to run for a second term.
And I will tell my friends on both sides of the aisle that regardless who the American people choose as their next president, Israel remains America's indispensable and strong ally in the Middle East.
That is what the Israeli leader says publicly. But analysts say in the potential race for the White House between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump, Netanyahu would prefer a Republican.
The Republicans are more supportive of Israel's security agenda, and that would be true whoever was in power in Israel. But the second thing is they're more forgiving of Israel's right-wing government and its policies towards the Palestinians.
Netanyahu has reportedly requested a meeting with former President Trump, who launched significant pro-Israel policies during his term. Trump brokered the Abraham Accords that normalize Israel's diplomatic ties with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. He moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to contested Jerusalem and recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights.
With Kamala, he's probably going to get someone who will remain pretty much mainstream when it comes to supporting the U.S.-Israeli relationship, but I think far tougher, certainly rhetorically and Israeli settlement activity, and much more sympathetic to Palestinian suffering and Palestinian rights.
Ultimately, Netanyahu's main goal in Washington is to prepare the groundwork for the next American administration. And with the Israeli Knesset nearing a 3-month recess, advancing his own goals in his fragile coalition.
There may be a political timing that will enable Netanyahu to make a move once the Knesset is in recess without having that lead to immediate coalition breakdown, because that could not be done until the Knesset comes back to operation.
During that time, Netanyahu could potentially go against far-right factions in his coalition and reach a ceasefire deal with Hamas after nearly 9 months of war. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said last week such a deal is within reach.
I believe we're inside the 10-yard line and driving toward the goal line and getting an agreement that would produce a ceasefire, get the hostages home, and put us on a better track to trying to build lasting peace and stability.
However, most analysts are skeptical the ceasefire deal will extend beyond phase 1, a 6-week pause in fighting in exchange for some of the hostages held by Hamas. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Washington.
Kenya was rocked Tuesday by another wave of anti-government protests. The Generation Z demonstrators are vowing to paralyze and occupy key locations across the country. Unlike previous protests, pro-government supporters turned out in numbers, asking anti-government protesters to give Ruto a chance to repair their grievances. For more perspective on the protest, I'm joined from Nairobi by Declan Galvin, an intelligence, political and security analyst. Mr. Galvin, welcome to Africa 54. The Gen Z protests are in their second month. What are they demanding this time around?
So overall, there's not a tremendous difference in what their demands are, today compared to several weeks ago. I think what is important to kind of identify is, as much as we're framing these protests as being led by Gen Z, kind of Generation Z, in reality, what we have in Kenya is a whole of society alignment around being disgruntled and unhappy with the current government policies and the current Ruto regime. And so that, I think, is really important, that it's really not just the youth generation who's focusing on this. It's really Kenyans from all strata of society.
And how has President Ruto responded to this? And would you say that Kenya's democracy is on the decline?
So I think Ruto's response has been piecemeal. Overall, the public appears to be unhappy with the amount of effort and attention he's given to their demands. He sacked his entire cabinet and then rehired, 5 or 6 of them, most of whom have been in their own, their old dockets. That's not something that the public was too enthusiastic about. In terms of Kenya's democracy being in decline, I kind of look at it in a different lens. There's a significant problem around enforcement and Kenya's institutions around political and legislative process. But democracy, I would argue, is at peak. You have people who are more engaged, more aligned around issue-based policy developments and laws than what we typically see in Kenya, where the political scene is more based around ethnic brokerage. So I would argue that these are actually good indicators in terms of democracy, but maybe bad indicators in terms of governance.
And very quickly, Declan, what options does President Ruto have to save the country from further decline?
So Ruto needs to seriously rethink his cabinet. He needs to start finding ways to engage with the public in a way that is amenable to them. People have been saying that his speeches have been arrogant or disconnected. And the third thing that Ruto really needs to do is to begin to propose policies, specifically economic spending and investment policies that are amenable to both the public and the business community. And those are really the key things he needs to be doing. Nothing's changed in the last month.
Mr. Galvin, many thanks. Declan Galvin is an intelligence, political and security analyst and managing director at Exigent Risk Advisory Management. Still to come, the United Nations works in Malawi to give at-risk children a future. We'll be right back.
This week on Straight Talk Africa, U.S. President Joe Biden drops out of the presidential race and endorses Vice President Kamala Harris. Can she mobilize and inspire the electorate? Join me, Vincent McCory, for an in-depth discussion on presidential election on the next Straight Talk Africa.
In other news, Uganda police were out in heavy numbers on the empty streets of Kampala on Tuesday ahead of a planned anti-corruption rally that has been banned by the authorities. President Yoweri Museveni had warned the demonstrators that they were, quote, playing with fire. Some members of the U.S. Congress are calling for South Africa to be excluded from the industry regulator. The United Nations' most recent statistics reveals that over 50
orphans and other vulnerable children in Malawi's Northern village can find named after her own daughter. She is a teacher by profession, but wanted to do more.
I started the foundation because of the problems that many homeless orphans were facing, so I thought of starting the foundation to take care of them and provide their needs.
Chirenga says the foundation helps to give the children what they need for success later in life.
We are providing education, food, shelter, spiritual help, different skills like farming, tailoring, carpentry, and some other things.
Some teachers in the community, like Nyuma Banda, are now offering free education at the orphanage.
Most of the students have benefited in this year because they weren't going to school before. They were lacking maybe school funds, so most of them were just street kids. So with the coming in with this initiative, it has brought a big impact on them. Most of them are coming to school.
14-year-old Judith Zonzi is one of the children at the orphanage and says the foundation has made a difference in her life.
At first, I had nowhere to stay and no one looked after me. When I met my mom, Tumani Chirenga, my life greatly changed. She pays for my school fees and does a lot of things that I need in my life.
Child rights activists like Madalitso Jidumu Wanoi are supportive but says there is a role for government as well.
But then the question of sustainability comes into play because it is the same government that should provide guidelines that will ensure that these interventions are sustainable. Because if everyone wakes up or any organization decides to do that, and by the end of the day, if in the process they close, it causes problems to the government and Malawi in general.
Most orphanages in Malawi are private institutions that get government help to operate. The government says it holds the orphanages to a high standard of care.
Institutions who are caring for children should be able to recruit a skilled social worker who should be at that institution so that he can carry easily the duties that the ministry usually recommends for in providing care and protection to children.
Chirenga says she hopes to see more initiatives like hers focused on helping orphans in Malawi work towards a brighter future. Chimwemwe Padata, VOA News, Ndodani Village in Nilongwe, Malawi.
It's time for our health report, and joining us now is Africa 54 health correspondent Lino Mudu with news on AIDS. Hello, Lino.
Hello, Esther. Hello, everyone. The world's largest HIV/AIDS conference is underway in Munich, Germany. More than 10,000 participants are attending the event that aims to be a platform for sharing research and best practice on combating the infection, which still causes many deaths worldwide. The 2024 UNAIDS Global Report launched at this year's conference shows that AIDS-related deaths have been cut by 69% since a peak in 2004 and by 51% since 2010. Figures from 2023 also show a drop in fatalities and an improvement in access to treatment for HIV-positive patients. The greatest decline in new infections were in sub-Saharan Africa. However, the UNAIDS agency warns that the progress remains fragile. About 1.3 million people were newly infected with HIV last year. That's an increase of 100,000 compared to 2022. Health advocates and
9 years ago, only 47% of people living with HIV were on treatment. Today, that figure is 77%. So a 30% increase in getting people on treatment in the last 9 years. But the world is not on track to end AIDS by 2030. A person dies from HIV-related illness every minute. It's still a crisis. One is to resource the response. The HIV response globally is short of $9.5 billion. This gap keeps increasing.
Now, health advocates and experts say while African countries are closer than ever to meeting the UN's targets of ending AIDS by 2030, there are a number of worrying trends that threaten that progress. Joining us now from the International AIDS Conference in Munich is Catherine Connor, Vice President of Policy and Advocacy of the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation, EGPAF. Ms. Connor, thank you for joining us. What are some of the main takeaways for you from the UNAIDS report?
Thank you for having me. I think the report really confirms the significant progress we've had in fighting HIV over the past 10 to 20 years, but it also really confirms how uneven that progress has been. So as noted, new infections in HIV are down, the lowest they've been since the 1980s. We now have 31 million people on treatment, which is a number we couldn't even imagine not that long ago. But when you start looking deeper, you see that in many places, infections are still high, particularly in adolescent girls and young women in Africa. And actually 1 out of 10 new infections in HIV is in children. So we need to really keep an eye on those places where the work isn't taking off and having as much progress as we'd like to see.
Several African countries have either met or surpassed the UN's 95 targets to end AIDS by 2030. That seems like progress, but your foundation says current global HIV response is failing children. Tell us more about that.
Thank you. The title of the UNAIDS report was The Urgency of Now. And I think the report really reveals the lack of urgency we've seen around treating children with HIV. the treatment gap between adults and children is actually on the rise. Only about half of children living with HIV are on treatment. And if you're one of those lucky few, only half are virally suppressed. And in fact, out of 8 age-related deaths that are being seen are in children. So this is not a population that's receiving the same attention as others are receiving, and we think that needs to change. If we're really going to end the AIDS epidemic, we have to end the inequities that are facing children.
Another issue is a funding shortfall in the global HIV response. Now, what are advocates and experts gathered in Munich saying about the state of funding for the global HIV response?
I think the lack of funding that we're seeing is really sobering. We all talk about HIV. It is preventable, it is treatable, but it is not curable. And not addressing the prevention and treatment needs today means we're just creating more problems for the future. It's hard to see how these funding shortfalls are going to be met. It's not going to be met by just one government, one actor. It's going to take everyone to really fill those funding gaps, particularly from domestic resources of African governments as well as international donors.
And Catherine Cano, thank you so much. We appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us from Munich.
Thank you.
And that's our health report for today. To stay in touch, find me on X at Lino Mudu. Back to you, Esther.
Thanks, Lino. Be sure to watch Lino Mudu's health reports every Tuesday right here on Africa 54. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.